In September 2023, a 79-year-old man sat down in front of a camera, took a slow breath, and said 6 words that would quietly detonate across the space research community. We were told, never, to discuss it. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't seeking attention. He had spent decades saying nothing. And now, after 50 years of silence, Colonel Raymond Holt was finally ready to talk. Nobody was prepared for what came next. Colonel Raymond Holt isn't a fringe voice or a retired clerk who processed moon mission paperwork from a desk in Houston. He was there, physically there. Part of the select group of fewer than 30 human beings who have ever stood on the surface of another world. He logged over 4,200 hours in space across 2 missions, received the Distinguished Service Medal, and spent the final decade of his NASA career as a senior mission consultant, meaning he didn't just go to the moon. He helped design the protocols for those who went after him. This is not a man prone to exaggeration. For decades, journalists asked. Researchers wrote letters. Space history enthusiasts sent questions through every available channel. And for decades, Holt gave the same answer. Polite, measured, final. I've said everything I'm permitted to say. But in late 2023, something shifted. His response, when pressed once more in a long-form interview with an independent aerospace history archive, was different. He paused, longer than felt comfortable, and then said, I'm 79. I've watched 3 colleagues take their full accounts to the grave. I don't intend to be the 4th. Think about what that means. A man of his credibility, his institutional loyalty, his career-long discipline, choosing at the end of his life to break. Not for money, not for fame, but because, in his own words, the public deserves to know what we encountered up there. So what, exactly, did I encounter? Here's something the history books mention but rarely dwell on. Every Apollo mission, every single one, had classified components withheld from public release for decades. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's documented fact. The National Security Act of 1947 gave NASA, in coordination with the Department of Defense, broad authority to classify mission data deemed sensitive to national security. And they used it. Liberally. What most people don't know is that the audio transmissions released to the public during the Apollo missions were not, and this is critical, they were not raw feeds. They were curated, processed through a filtering system at Mission Control that allowed communications officers to delay, edit, or entirely suppress specific exchanges before they reached public broadcast. NASA acknowledged this system existed. They described it, blandly, as a communications security protocol. But several researchers who spent years filing Freedom of Information requests have since obtained partial transcripts that don't match, in key passages, the official public record. Dr. Linda Ferrazzi, a science historian at the University of Arizona who spent 11 years analyzing declassified NASA communications archives, put it this way in a 2021 paper. The gaps are not random. They are, structurally, too consistent to be equipment malfunction. Something was being managed. And then there's the infamous communication blackout, the one that still doesn't have a fully satisfying official explanation. During Apollo 11, there was a 2-minute and 17-second period during which public transmission was cut entirely. NASA's explanation involved a routine antenna realignment. But former communications technician Carl Druitt, who worked the console during that mission and gave a recorded statement before his death in 2019, said, "That wasn't a technical issue. We were told, verbally, directly, to cut the public feed. I followed the instruction. I always assumed I'd eventually find out why. I never did." 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Sounds small. But on the surface of the moon, in the silence of another world, 2 minutes and 17 seconds is an enormous amount of time. And that's where Raymond Holt's account doesn't just add a detail. It rewrites the entire chapter. What Holt described, calmly, without theatrical flourish, was a structured anomaly observed during the final EVA of his mission. An EVA, or extravehicular activity, is what happens when astronauts leave the lunar module and walk on the surface. During his final surface excursion, Holt and his mission partner were conducting geological sampling approximately 800 meters from the landing site when their instruments registered something unexpected. "We had a localized electromagnetic reading," Holt said in the interview, "that didn't correspond to any geological feature we'd been briefed on. It wasn't fluctuating. It was steady, directional. My partner looked at me. I looked at him. We reported it to Mission Control using standard protocol. The response from Mission Control was immediate, but it was not what either astronaut expected. They didn't ask us to investigate, Holt said. They asked us, specifically, to note the coordinates, cease approach, and return to the module. The language they used was, and I remember this clearly, do not advance, log and return. That was the protocol. We'd never heard it used before. We didn't know, until that moment, that it even existed. Holt and his partner complied. They returned to the module, and when the mission transcripts were released to the public years later, that exchange, the exchange about the electromagnetic reading, the coordinates, the log and return instruction, was gone, not summarized, not paraphrased, gone. Now here's where the story gets truly extraordinary, because he wasn't the only one. The extraordinary thing isn't that Raymond Holt said this. It's that when you begin mapping his account against other declassified materials, independently gathered testimonies, and Soviet-era space program records, the same shape keeps appearing. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14. Astronaut, the sixth human to walk on the moon, and a man with a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, spent the final years of his life making statements that the scientific establishment never quite knew how to handle. He didn't speak in vague terms. He spoke specifically about encounters, about information shared by intelligence officials after his mission, about a pattern of phenomena that NASA was, in his view, institutionally unprepared to process. Mitchell's statements were largely dismissed during his lifetime. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody who dismissed them ever actually refuted the specific claims. They simply moved on. Then there are the Soviet records. Newly digitized archives from the Russian Federal Space Agency, portions of which were reviewed by researchers at the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna, contain mission logs from unmanned Soviet lunar probes that registered similar localized electromagnetic anomalies in multiple locations across the lunar surface. The Soviets, famously tight with their data, especially during the Cold War, classified those readings under a designation that translates, roughly, as phenomena of uncertain terrestrial origin. Uncertain terrestrial origin. That phrase, in the dry language of Soviet scientific bureaucracy, is extraordinary because terrestrial means of the Earth, and what they were saying, carefully, technically, is that they could not identify the source as anything originating from our planet, or, by implication, from any known natural process. Independent researcher and former aerospace engineer Martin Crowe, who has spent 12 years cross-referencing NASA mission data with Soviet lunar probe readings, said in a 2022 lecture at the International Astronautical Congress, "The correlation between anomalous readings across American and Soviet missions isn't something you can explain with instrument error. The instruments were different, the missions were different, the agencies were adversaries, and yet, the data rhymes." The data rhymes. Notice something. The researchers who have spent years attempting to access the full, unredacted mission transcripts haven't been laughed at. They've been quietly stonewalled. Freedom of information requests related to specific Apollo mission communications are, to this day, returned with significant redactions. Not all of them, but specific ones. The ones involving surface anomaly reporting. The ones involving what NASA internally classified as non-standard environmental observations. Why? Specifically those. Documents obtained by journalist and space history researcher Diane Calloway in 2020 revealed that a standing interagency directive, co-signed by representatives from NASA, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council, existed as far back as 1969. Its purpose, as stated in the surviving portion of the document, was to prevent premature public disclosure of mission data that could generate unmanageable public response prior to sufficient scientific contextualization. Unmanageable public response. That's not the language of routine national security. That's the language of institutional fear. Someone, somewhere, was concerned that if the public knew what the astronauts were seeing and reporting, the response would be unmanageable. Think about what kind of information would produce that concern. Think about what they would have needed to see to use that word. And now, the most shocking part of all. Near the end of the interview, Raymond Holt said something that stopped everyone in the room. He was asked, directly, whether he believed the anomaly he observed had a natural explanation. He was quiet for a long moment, a long, deliberate moment, and then he said, "I spent 50 years hoping someone smarter than me would find one. I'm still waiting." He wasn't performing. He wasn't reaching for drama. He was a 79-year-old engineer, trained to deal in facts, telling you that after a lifetime of looking for a rational framework for what he experienced, he hadn't found one. The official record says the moon is silent, geologically static, and fully understood. But a retired astronaut, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by staying quiet, chose to speak. Other astronauts made similar choices. Soviet scientists logged similar data. Researchers across 3 continents have found the same patterns in the gaps of our official history. What does that tell you? Maybe the moon is exactly what we were told it is, an airless, crater-pocked rock that humanity briefly visited and then abandoned. Maybe every anomaly has a mundane explanation that simply requires more data to surface. Or maybe the silence that surrounded these missions for 50 years wasn't about national security in the way we typically understand it. Maybe it was about something we don't yet have, the scientific language to explain. What do you think really happened up there? Was Holt describing a geological phenomenon that Mission Control didn't want to cause public panic over before they understood it themselves? Or is there something in those redacted transcripts that would genuinely change how we understand our place in the universe? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. And if this investigation stayed with you, you won't believe what I found when I started pulling the thread on what other retired NASA personnel have quietly disclosed in the last 3 years. That story is coming soon. Because the truth is far stranger than anyone imagines.